There's a specific kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from growing up feeling unseen, not abandoned in the obvious ways, not always neglected in ways other people could point to. Sometimes your parents provided food, school, routines, birthdays, and family photos. From the outside, everything looked normal, but emotionally, something was missing. Maybe no one noticed when you were hurting, unless your pain became inconvenient. Maybe your emotions were treated like overreactions. Maybe you learned very early that being easy, quiet, or mature earned you more acceptance than being honest. So you adapted. You became the calm one, the helper, the achiever, the funny one, the independent one who doesn't need anything. And eventually, you stopped asking for emotional support because asking felt humiliating. You learned how to say, "I'm fine," before anyone could ask another question. You learned how to hide disappointment quickly. You learned how to sit with heavy feelings alone because somewhere along the way, you stopped believing comfort would come. That kind of loneliness follows people into adulthood quietly. It shows up when you're having a hard day, but cannot bring yourself to call anyone. It shows up when someone is kind to you and you immediately feel suspicious or uncomfortable. It shows up when you constantly feel like a burden for having emotions everyone else seems allowed to have. And sometimes, the saddest part is that you become so used to emotional emptiness that you stop recognizing it as emptiness. You tell yourself, "This is normal. I'm just sensitive. Maybe I expect too much. Maybe needing comfort is weakness." But needing love was never weakness. Needing reassurance was never weakness. Wanting someone to sit with your pain instead of dismissing it was never weakness. Carl Jung once wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents." And many children unknowingly carry emotional responsibilities that were never theirs. Maybe you became emotionally mature too early because the adults around you were overwhelmed themselves. Maybe you learned to stay quiet because other people's emotions filled the room. Maybe you became the listener, the caretaker, the peacekeeper, because nobody seemed able to hold your feelings, too. Children are incredibly adaptive. If love feels conditional, they adapt. If affection disappears during conflict, they adapt. If vulnerability is ignored, they adapt. But adaptation is not the same as healing. A child who constantly has to earn emotional safety grows into an adult who struggles to relax in love. That's why some people overthink every text message. Why they panic when someone's tone changes slightly. Why silence feels threatening. Why they apologize even when they've done nothing wrong. Because part of them is still trying to prevent emotional disconnection before it happens. And deep down, many people carry a painful question they rarely say out loud. What was so difficult about loving me? That question can follow someone for years. It appears in relationships, in friendships, in moments of rejection, in the way they speak to themselves after mistakes. Sometimes people become perfectionists, hoping achievement will finally make them feel worthy. Sometimes they become emotionally distant because needing people feels dangerous. Sometimes they stay in unhealthy relationships because a small amount of affection still feels better than emotional emptiness. And often, they blame themselves for all of it. But children do not blame their caregivers at first. They blame themselves. If they feel ignored, they assume they are unimportant. If they feel unwanted, they assume they are difficult to love. If their emotions are dismissed, they assume their feelings are wrong. Those beliefs do not disappear automatically with age. They quietly become the foundation of adulthood. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And this is why healing begins with awareness, not harshness, not self-hatred. Awareness. The moment you begin recognizing that many of your fears were shaped by emotional experiences you never chose, something inside you softens. You begin understanding why reassurance matters so much to you, why rejection cuts so deeply, why you struggle to believe people truly care sometimes. You stop seeing yourself as too emotional and start seeing yourself as someone who adapted to emotional absence the best way they could. And maybe that changes the question completely. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" you begin asking, "What kind of love was I forced to live without?" Because the truth is, many people were taught how to survive long before they were taught how to feel safe, valued, and emotionally held. And healing begins when you finally decide that your emotional needs are not something to be ashamed of anymore. A lot of people think personality is something we freely choose, but sometimes what we call personality is actually survival. The person who laughs through everything may have learned that sadness made other people uncomfortable. The person who overachieves may have learned praise was the closest thing to affection. The person who avoids conflict may have grown up around unpredictable reactions and learned that emotional safety depended on staying agreeable. And after years of repeating these patterns, they stop feeling like coping mechanisms. They start feeling like identity. You say things like, "This is just how I am. I've always been this way. I don't really need people. I'm just anxious. I'm too sensitive." But underneath those words is often an older story, a story about adaptation. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And many people spend years believing their survival patterns are simply their personality. The overly independent person may not truly enjoy carrying everything alone. They may have just learned early that vulnerability did not feel safe. The people pleaser may not naturally agree with everyone. They may have learned that upsetting people risked rejection, tension, or emotional withdrawal. The perfectionist may not simply have high standards. They may have learned that mistakes changed how they were treated. Children pay close attention to emotional environments. Even when nobody explains things directly, children notice tone changes, silence, disappointment, distance, and emotional tension. And slowly, they shape themselves around what feels safest. Some children become invisible. They stop expressing needs. They become low maintenance because they sense there is no room for their emotions. Some become hyper-responsible. They grow up too fast. They comfort others before learning how to comfort themselves. Some become emotionally guarded, not because they don't feel deeply, but because they learned that showing feelings can lead to shame, dismissal, or loneliness. And many adults still carry these patterns without realizing where they began. For example, maybe someone takes longer than usual to respond to your message. Logically, you know they could simply be busy. But emotionally, something inside you immediately tightens. You reread the conversation. You wonder if you said something wrong. You feel embarrassed for caring so much. You try to distract yourself, but your mind keeps returning to it. That reaction is rarely about one message. It is often connected to older emotional memories your body still remembers. Maybe connection once felt unstable. Maybe affection disappeared unpredictably. Maybe you had to constantly monitor other people's moods to feel emotionally safe. So now your nervous system reacts quickly, even when your rational mind tries to stay calm. This is why healing is not as simple as thinking positively. You cannot force yourself out of emotional patterns that were built through years of experience. You have to understand them first. And understanding yourself requires compassion, not excuses, not blame. Compassion. Because many people secretly carry shame for the ways they adapted. They feel embarrassed by how anxious they become, embarrassed by how much reassurance they need, embarrassed by how difficult it feels to trust people. But survival responses are not character flaws. They are emotional strategies your mind created to protect you. The problem is that protective patterns that helped you survive childhood can begin hurting you in adulthood. Being emotionally guarded may protect you from disappointment, but it can also block intimacy. People-pleasing may help avoid conflict, but it can slowly erase your sense of self. Perfectionism may earn approval, but it often creates exhaustion instead of peace. And eventually, you reach a point where survival stops feeling sustainable. You become tired of overthinking every interaction, tired of feeling guilty for resting, tired of pretending you are okay when internally you feel emotionally overwhelmed. That exhaustion is important, because sometimes healing begins the moment survival no longer works the way it used to. Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." But before people can choose differently, they first have to recognize what shaped them. They have to notice the moments where fear speaks louder than reality. The moments where old emotional wounds quietly take control. The moments where they abandon themselves just to feel accepted. And this awareness can feel painful at first, because once you see your patterns clearly, you cannot unsee them. You realize how often you apologize unnecessarily, how often you shrink yourself around others, how often your self-worth changes based on someone else's mood, attention, or approval. But awareness is not punishment. Awareness is the beginning of freedom. Because when you finally understand that many of your behaviors were learned forms of protection, you stop treating yourself like a broken person. You begin seeing yourself as someone who adapted the best way they could. And maybe for the first time, you stop asking, "Why am I like this?" and start asking, "What happened that made these behaviors feel necessary?" That question changes everything. Because healing is not about becoming someone completely different. It is about learning that you no longer need to survive every moment as if love could disappear at any second. It is about teaching yourself that safety does not always require silence, perfection, or self-erasure. And slowly, little by little, you begin separating who you truly are from the survival version of yourself you created just to make it through. One of the most painful things about emotional neglect is how invisible it can be. When people think about childhood wounds, they often imagine obvious cruelty. They imagine shouting, punishment, or visible dysfunction. But emotional neglect is quieter than that. Sometimes it sounds like, "You're overreacting. Stop being dramatic. You're too sensitive. You'll be fine." And sometimes it sounds like nothing at all. No comfort, no questions, no emotional support when you were hurting. Just silence where understanding should have been. That is what makes emotional neglect so confusing. You may grow up feeling deeply lonely without fully understanding why. You may look back at your childhood and struggle to explain what hurt because there are no dramatic stories to point to. Only an absence of emotional closeness, an absence of feeling emotionally safe enough to fully be yourself, an absence of feeling truly known. And because the wound is invisible, many people spend years minimizing it. They say, "My parents tried their best. Nothing terrible happened to me. I shouldn't complain." So they dismiss their own pain before anyone else has the chance to. But emotional neglect leaves traces in people's lives. It teaches children to disconnect from themselves. A child who constantly feels emotionally dismissed learns to stop expressing emotions openly. A child who feels ignored learns not to expect comfort. A child who feels unseen begins believing their inner world does not matter. Over time, this becomes automatic. You stop asking for help, even when you desperately need it. You tell people you're okay while quietly struggling inside. You become so used to carrying emotional pain alone that support starts feeling unfamiliar. Sometimes people affected by emotional neglect become hyper-independent, not because they truly want to do everything alone, but because depending on others feels unsafe or disappointing. They tell themselves, "I can handle it. I don't need anyone. I'll figure it out myself." But underneath that independence is often grief. Grief from all the moments they needed emotional support and learned not to expect it. Carl Jung once wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." And emotional neglect creates exactly that kind of loneliness. You may be surrounded by people and still feel emotionally disconnected. You may struggle to explain your feelings because no one taught you how. You may feel emotionally overwhelmed, but unable to identify what is actually wrong. Many emotionally neglected adults become disconnected from their own needs. They know how to care for others, They know how to show up for responsibilities. But when it comes to themselves, there is confusion. What do I actually feel? What do I need? What would make me feel safe or comforted? Those questions can feel strangely difficult, because when emotional needs are ignored long enough, people stop listening to themselves. And this often appears in relationships too. Some people become overly attached because they are starving for emotional connection. Others become distant because closeness feels unfamiliar and frightening. Some accept very little from others because deep down they believe asking for more will only lead to disappointment. They settle for inconsistency, for half-hearted affection, for relationships where they feel emotionally alone even while technically connected to someone. Not because they enjoy being hurt, but because emotional deprivation can make unhealthy dynamics feel normal. And perhaps one of the saddest parts of emotional neglect is this. Many people do not realize how deeply hurt they are until someone finally treats them with genuine care. A person listens patiently to them, remembers small details, responds gently instead of dismissively, and suddenly they feel emotional. Not because the moment is dramatic, but because their nervous system is experiencing something unfamiliar, being emotionally considered. That experience can bring both comfort and grief. Comfort because it feels good. Grief because it reveals what was missing for so long. Jung said, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people." But before people can understand others deeply, they often have to first acknowledge the pain they spent years ignoring inside themselves. And that acknowledgement can be difficult, because many emotionally neglected people were taught to downplay their feelings automatically. Even now, they may read something like this and think, maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe it wasn't that serious. But emotional wounds do not need to look extreme to leave lasting effects. A person can survive childhood and still carry deep emotional loneliness into adulthood. They can become successful, responsible, and functional, while internally feeling disconnected from themselves. That is the quiet grief of emotional neglect. It is not always loud. It is not always visible. Sometimes it simply feels like spending your whole life trying to earn a kind of emotional safety you never fully received. But healing begins when you stop dismissing your own emotional reality, when you stop telling yourself your pain is not enough to matter, because your feelings mattered then, and they still matter now. And maybe part of healing is finally giving yourself the attention, patience, and emotional understanding that was missing for so long. Many people carry an inner voice that feels harsh, impatient, and impossible to satisfy. A voice that appears the moment something goes wrong. You forget something small and immediately think, what is wrong with me? You make a mistake and suddenly feel ashamed for hours. You disappoint someone and instantly feel like a bad person. You struggle emotionally and then criticize yourself for struggling. Over time, this voice becomes so familiar that you stop questioning it. You assume it's simply who you are. But often, that inner voice was not born naturally. It was learned slowly through repeated emotional experiences. Carl Jung once wrote, "Children are educated by what the adult is and not by his talk." Children absorb emotional environments deeply. They notice facial expressions, tone changes, silence, disappointment, tension, criticism, and emotional distance. Even when nobody explains things directly, children still feel what surrounds them. And when a child repeatedly experiences criticism, dismissal, emotional coldness, or conditional affection, they begin internalizing those experiences. Eventually, the outside voice becomes the inside voice. Maybe you grew up feeling like mistakes made you less lovable. Maybe your emotions were minimized whenever you expressed them. Maybe you were compared to others so often that you started believing you would never be enough. Or maybe nobody directly insulted you at all. Sometimes the deepest damage comes from emotional absence, from never being reassured, never being comforted consistently, never hearing gentle words during difficult moments. So you learned to handle pain alone. And over time, your inner world became shaped more by pressure than compassion. That is why so many adults speak to themselves in ways they would never speak to another human being. They call themselves lazy for being exhausted, weak for needing comfort, embarrassing for having emotions, pathetic for struggling. And underneath all that self-criticism is usually an old fear. If I am not good enough, careful enough, useful enough, or successful enough, maybe I will lose love. That fear runs deeper than most people realize. It affects relationships, work, rest, boundaries, self-worth. Some people become perfectionists because mistakes feel emotionally dangerous. Some over-explain themselves constantly because they fear being misunderstood or rejected. Some apologize for everything because they learned conflict could threaten connection. And many people carry guilt even when they have done nothing wrong. The exhausting part is that this inner criticism rarely creates peace. No matter how hard you push yourself, the voice always demands more. Be better. Do more. Stop feeling this way. Why can't you just handle things normally? And after years of hearing that voice internally, people begin believing they deserve it. But healing starts when you realize something important. The way you speak to yourself is not always the truth. Sometimes it is the echo of old emotional experiences. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And many people do not realize how deeply their inner voice shapes their emotional life. If your inner voice is cruel, rest feels undeserved. Love feels uncertain. Mistakes feel catastrophic. And emotional safety becomes difficult to maintain. That is why self-parenting matters so much. Because healing is not just about understanding your wounds intellectually. It is about changing the emotional environment you live inside every day. Your mind is an environment. Your inner voice becomes part of that environment. And if your inner world constantly attacks you your nervous system never fully relaxes. This is why small moments of self-compassion matter more than people think. Moments like saying, "I'm overwhelmed right now, and that's okay." Or, "I made a mistake, but that doesn't make me worthless." Or, "I deserve patience too." At first, these thoughts may feel unnatural, even uncomfortable, because if you grew up around criticism, gentleness can feel unfamiliar. Some people even feel guilty for being kind to themselves. They worry it will make them weak, lazy, or selfish. But self-compassion is not self-indulgence. It is emotional care. It is learning to respond to yourself the way a safe, emotionally healthy person would. Not with endless judgment, not with shame, but with understanding. That does not mean avoiding accountability. It means separating accountability from cruelty. You can grow without hating yourself. You can improve without humiliating yourself. You can acknowledge mistakes without turning them into proof that you are unworthy. And perhaps this is one of the most important parts of healing childhood emotional wounds. Learning that your inner voice does not have to sound like pain forever. It can become calmer, kinder, safer. Not overnight, not perfectly, but slowly through awareness and repetition, you begin changing the emotional tone inside your own mind. You begin noticing when self-criticism appears automatically. You pause before attacking yourself. You question beliefs that once felt permanent. And over time, something shifts. You stop treating yourself like an enemy. You stop speaking to yourself only through pressure and disappointment. You begin becoming someone your younger self would have felt safe with. And for many people, that changes everything. Self-parenting sounds simple when people first hear the term, but emotionally, it can feel unfamiliar in ways that are difficult to explain. Because if you grew up without consistent emotional support, you may not know what healthy emotional care is supposed to feel like. You may know how to survive, how to stay productive, how to keep going when things hurt. But caring for yourself emotionally, that can feel uncomfortable at first. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And for many people, becoming who they truly are begins with learning how to stop abandoning themselves. Self-parenting is not about pretending your childhood did not affect you. It is not about blaming yourself for your wounds either. It is about recognizing that the emotional care you missed still matters. And now, slowly, you begin learning how to provide some of that care to yourself. Not perfectly, not all at once, but gently and consistently. For many people, self-parenting starts with awareness. You notice how harshly you speak to yourself when you struggle. You notice how quickly you dismiss your own feelings. You notice how uncomfortable you become when you need rest, comfort, reassurance, or support. And maybe for the first time, instead of criticizing those needs, you become curious about them. You ask, why do I feel guilty for resting? Why do I panic when someone is upset with me? Why do I feel selfish for having emotional needs? Those questions matter. Because healing often begins the the moment you stop judging your reactions and start understanding them. A child who was emotionally neglected learns to neglect themselves. A child who was constantly criticized learns to criticize themselves. A child who had to earn affection learns to overwork for love. These patterns do not disappear automatically with age. They continue quietly in adulthood until someone consciously interrupts them. That interruption is part of self-parenting. It happens in ordinary moments, like noticing you are exhausted and allowing yourself to rest instead of forcing yourself to keep going, or realizing you are emotionally overwhelmed and speaking to yourself gently instead of calling yourself weak, or setting a boundary without apologizing for needing one. At first, these actions may feel unnatural. You may hear an inner voice saying, "You're being dramatic. You're lazy. You should be able to handle this." But that voice is often rooted in old conditioning, not truth. Self-parenting means learning how to respond differently. Instead of, "Why am I like this?" you slowly begin saying, "Of course this hurts. Of course I'm tired. Of course this reaction exists." That shift may seem small, but emotionally, it is enormous, because many people have spent their entire lives responding to themselves with pressure instead of compassion. They push themselves through burnout, ignore their emotional needs, stay in unhealthy situations too long, treat themselves with less patience than they offer everyone else, and eventually, the emotional exhaustion becomes impossible to ignore. That is often when healing truly begins, not when life becomes perfect, but when you finally realize you cannot continue treating yourself like someone unworthy of care. Jung said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." And self-parenting is part of that becoming. It is choosing to create emotional safety inside yourself, even if you did not grow up with it. That does not mean you never struggle again. You still have difficult days. You still get triggered. You still feel old fears sometimes. But your response begins changing. Instead of abandoning yourself during pain, you stay emotionally present. You comfort yourself after disappointment instead of attacking yourself. You allow yourself to feel emotions without shame. You stop treating your needs like inconveniences. And over time, your relationship with yourself slowly softens. You begin trusting yourself more. You stop seeing emotions as weakness. You stop believing your worth depends entirely on productivity, perfection, or approval. One of the most powerful parts of self-parenting is learning how to give yourself what was once missing. Maybe nobody reassured you consistently, so now you learn to reassure yourself during fear. Maybe nobody protected your emotional boundaries, so now you begin protecting them yourself. Maybe nobody encouraged your feelings openly, so now you allow your emotions to exist without immediately dismissing them. These moments may seem small from the outside, but internally, they are deeply healing. Because every time you respond to yourself with patience instead of shame, you are creating a new emotional experience. You are teaching your nervous system something it may not have learned before, that care can exist without punishment. And slowly, self-parenting changes the way you move through life. You stop chasing people who only value the version of you that ignores their own needs. You stop forcing yourself to stay emotionally silent just to keep others comfortable. You stop measuring your worth only through what you provide for others. Instead, you begin building a different kind of relationship with yourself. One rooted in patience, in emotional honesty, in self-respect, in compassion. And perhaps that is what healing really is. Not becoming perfect, not erasing the past, but becoming the kind of person your younger self desperately needed when they were hurting and alone. A person who listens, who stays, who cares, who no longer turns away from their own pain. And maybe for the first time in your life, you begin realizing that you deserve that kind of care too. One of the hardest truths about healing is that it can feel incredibly lonely at first. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because healing changes the way you relate to yourself, to others, and to the life you've always known. And change, even healthy change, can feel isolating. Carl Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." What he meant is that awareness changes you. The moment you begin seeing your patterns clearly, you can no longer live the same way unconsciously. You start noticing how often you silence yourself to keep others comfortable, how often you apologize for having needs, how often you ignore your exhaustion just to avoid disappointing people. And once you see those patterns, continuing them becomes painful in a new way. So you begin changing, slowly, awkwardly, imperfectly. You start saying no more often. You stop over-explaining yourself constantly. You begin recognizing when relationships leave you emotionally drained instead of emotionally safe. And not everyone understands that version of you. Some people were comfortable with the version of you that never complained, the version that always gave more than they received, the version that stayed quiet about their own pain. So when you begin protecting your emotional well-being, some relationships shift. That can feel heartbreaking, especially for people who learned early in life that love depended on self-sacrifice. When you grow up emotionally wounded, keeping connection often feels more important than protecting yourself. You learn to tolerate discomfort, to ignore red flags, to shrink your feelings, to become who others need you to be. Because losing connection once felt emotionally dangerous. So healing creates an uncomfortable conflict inside you. Part of you wants peace. Another part fears rejection. You may set a healthy boundary and then spend hours feeling guilty afterward. You may choose rest and still feel anxious the entire time. You may speak honestly about your feelings and immediately worry you were too much. That fear does not mean healing is wrong. It simply means your nervous system is adjusting to a new way of living. And that adjustment can feel lonely. Because for a while, you exist between two versions of yourself. The old version, who survived by abandoning their needs, and the new version, learning how to honor them. That space in between can feel uncertain. Some relationships become distant. Some conversations feel different. Some people misunderstand your growth completely. And perhaps the hardest part is realizing that healing does not always bring immediate comfort. Sometimes it first brings grief. Grief for the child you used to be. Grief for the emotional support you needed, but never received. Grief for the years spent believing you had to earn love by exhausting yourself. Many people underestimate how painful that grief can feel. Because when you begin healing, you do not only face the present, you also begin feeling old sadness that was buried under survival for years. Memories return differently. Certain realizations suddenly hit harder. You recognize how long you have been emotionally carrying things alone. And there are moments where that realization can feel overwhelming. You may wonder, why did nobody notice how much I was hurting? Why did I learn to comfort everyone except myself? Why did I spend so much of my life believing my needs were a problem? These questions are painful because they touch something very deep. The longing to have been cared for differently. Jung once said, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people." But before people can truly understand themselves, they often have to stop running from their pain. And that process can feel lonely because distraction no longer works the same way. You begin sitting with feelings you once avoided. You become more emotionally honest with yourself. You stop pretending certain things did not hurt. That honesty is healing. But it is also emotionally heavy at times, especially when the people around you are uncomfortable with emotional depth. Some people may tell you to just move on. Some may minimize your feelings because they do not understand them. Others may prefer the old version of you because your healing challenges familiar dynamics. And this is where many people feel tempted to abandon themselves again, to shrink back down, to stop speaking honestly, to return to old patterns just to feel accepted. But healing asks something different from you. It asks you to stay connected to yourself even when it feels uncomfortable, to stop betraying your emotional reality for temporary approval. And over time, something begins changing. The loneliness softens, not because life becomes perfect, but because your relationship with yourself becomes stronger. You begin realizing that emotional safety matters more than forced connection. That peace matters more than constant people-pleasing. That being understood by a few safe people feels better than performing for everyone. And perhaps the most important shift is this. You stop measuring love by how much you can endure. You stop believing suffering is the price of connection. Instead, you begin choosing relationships where you can exist honestly, where your emotions are not treated like burdens, where you do not have to abandon yourself to belong. That kind of healing takes time. And yes, sometimes it feels lonely along the way. But there is also something deeply beautiful about finally becoming someone who no longer leaves themselves behind just to keep others close. As you begin healing emotionally, your relationships slowly begin to change too. Not all at once, not dramatically overnight, but little by little, you start noticing things you once ignored. You notice how certain people only reach out when they need something. You notice how exhausted you feel after constantly carrying other people emotionally. You notice how often you silence yourself just to avoid tension or disappointment. And perhaps the hardest part is realizing how normal these dynamics once felt to you. Carl Jung once wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." Relationships shape people deeply, especially for someone who grew up emotionally unseen or emotionally uncertain. When a child grows up feeling like love must be earned, they often carry that belief into adulthood without realizing it. They become the person who gives endlessly, the person who over-explains, the person who tolerates inconsistency because they are afraid asking for more will push people away. And for a long time, these behaviors can feel like love. But eventually, healing changes your perspective. You begin asking difficult questions. Why do I feel anxious around certain people all the time? Why do I feel responsible for everyone else's emotions? Why do I constantly fear being too much in relationships? And slowly, you start recognizing patterns that once felt invisible. You realize how often you ignored your own discomfort to maintain connection. How often you accepted emotional crumbs because part of you believed you should be grateful for any affection at all. Many emotionally wounded people become deeply attached to inconsistency, not because they enjoy pain, but because unpredictability feels familiar. A delayed response can feel emotionally overwhelming. A small change in tone can create panic. A little affection after emotional distance can feel intensely relieving. This emotional cycle becomes exhausting. You spend so much time trying to secure love that you rarely stop to ask, does this relationship actually feel emotionally safe? Healing changes that question. You stop focusing only on whether someone wants you. You begin noticing whether they care for you gently, consistently, and respectfully. And that shift changes relationships in powerful ways. Some connections become stronger. Others begin falling apart. That can feel painful, because not every relationship survives the moment you stop abandoning yourself. Some people were only comfortable with the version of you that overgave, the version that stayed silent about hurt feelings, the version that accepted less than they deserved without complaint. So when you begin setting boundaries, people react differently. Some respect your growth, others resist it. And for emotionally wounded people, resistance can feel terrifying. You may immediately feel guilty for disappointing someone. You may question yourself repeatedly. You may wonder if protecting your peace makes you selfish. But protecting yourself emotionally is not selfish. It is necessary. Jung said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." And part of becoming healthier emotionally is learning that love should not require self-erasure. Healthy relationships do not demand constant emotional exhaustion. They do not punish vulnerability. They do not make you feel like your needs are burdens. For many people, this realization feels unfamiliar at first. Because if chaos was normalized emotionally, calmness can initially feel strange. You may mistake emotional unavailability for mystery. You may confuse inconsistency with passion. You may feel more emotionally drawn to people who trigger your old wounds because the emotional intensity feels familiar. But healing teaches discernment. It teaches you to notice how people make you feel consistently, not just occasionally. Do you feel emotionally safe around them? Can you express discomfort honestly? Do they listen with care, or only when it benefits them? Do you feel accepted as yourself, or only when you are easy, useful, and undemanding? These questions matter deeply. Because many people spend years chasing relationships that repeat old emotional patterns. Relationships where they have to earn attention, earn reassurance, earn care, and eventually they become emotionally exhausted from trying to prove they are worthy of being loved properly. Healing interrupts that cycle. Slowly, you stop chasing people who constantly make you question your worth. You stop romanticizing emotional inconsistency. You stop shrinking yourself just to maintain closeness. And perhaps, most importantly, you begin changing your relationship with yourself. You stop measuring your value through how needed you are. You stop believing love must hurt to be real. You stop treating your emotional needs like inconveniences. That inner shift changes everything externally, too. You become more honest, more grounded, more aware of what actually feels healthy. And yes, that awareness can feel lonely at times, because once you begin valuing emotional safety, some relationships no longer fit the life you are trying to build. You are allowed to choose relationships where you feel emotionally seen, emotionally respected, and emotionally safe. And for someone who spent years surviving emotionally, that realization can change their entire life. Healing does not mean pretending the past did not hurt. It means refusing to let that pain decide your entire future. Slowly, you begin building a different relationship with yourself. One based on compassion instead of shame, on honesty instead of emotional suppression, on self-respect instead of self-abandonment. And the beautiful thing is that this changes more than just your inner world. It changes your relationships, your boundaries, your choices, your sense of worth. You stop chasing people who only value your silence. You stop proving your worth through exhaustion. You stop believing love must be painful to feel real. Instead, you begin choosing what feels emotionally safe, calm, and genuine. And perhaps that is what becoming the person you needed truly means. It means staying with yourself during hard moments instead of turning against yourself. And maybe healing is not about becoming perfect, after all. Maybe it is simply about learning that you deserved love long before you learned how to survive without it.